Welcome, everyone. Dr. Chanan Gafni is the last class for this session about the origins of academic Jewish studies. We're very excited. This has been such a great series. And I'll turn this to you, Dr. Gafni.
Okay, thank you very, very much. Today is indeed the last session of this mini-series, and we want to cover one more theme today, but also maybe make some sort of a summary and maybe even a brief review of some stuff that we've spoken about, maybe at the very end, if time allows. Okay, so I'm sharing my screen with you, and we'll remember where we stopped. So here we go. This mini-series, I always repeat myself, I know. This mini-series was divided into two parts. The first part, the first two sessions, more about the theoretical aspect of modern Jewish studies. We were talking about the historical context, the ideology, and so on. And the second part of the series was devoted not to the theoretical aspect, but actually to see what was modern Jewish studies all about, how it was actually carried for real. And what we were trying to do is talk about four dimensions that were introduced by modern scholars and see how they also played a role when scholars were discussing mainly, I would say, Jewish law, rabbinic law, using their critical insights. The first aspect was the time dimension, the time ingredient. We're talking about the willingness to acknowledge the fact that our tradition is something dynamic and not static. And we explored this theme through the mystery of the oral law. We're trying to understand how the conception of oral law was treated throughout history. And we saw that in modern times, people make room for the realization that oral law is actually the means that allows halakha to change, Jewish law to change. So that was the first theme. The second theme was about the variety, the realization that there's not just one Jewish tradition, but rather a variety or many voices that we can trace, many tendency or approaches within Judaism. And the example we provided for that was the discovery of the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, although, as I said, it's not the only example for this. The third theme we were talking about was taking into account the context. The Jewish tradition is not isolated. It has a general context. And this is true with regards to every one of its stages. When we speak about the Bible, so there is this Near Eastern context. Rabbinic literature, the Tannaitic literature has its Hellenistic context. And when we're turning to the Talmud, so then or especially to the Babylonian Talmud, we were taking into account the Persian context. So this is the other element, another dimension of modern scholarship. The last one was becoming more skeptical, understanding that the rabbis are just human beings. They have their agendas, they make mistakes, they're not just perfect. And we were trying to explore that, focusing on two themes. The first theme that we've discussed in the previous session involved the idea of pshuto shel mikra, realizing that the rabbis, when they interpret the Tanakh, the Torah, essentially, they might be deviating from what the plain sense of the text of the Torah is saying. And we're trying a little bit to explore that and to see in what ways did modern Jewish scholars advance this realization, both in terms of discovering more texts, but also developing new ideas of how to understand the whole conception of drash. Today, we'll talk about another realization or another revolution that came about in the 19th century that involves another stage in the transmission of halakha. We're going to talk about the shift from the Tannaitic to the Amoraitic literature, from the Mishnah to the Talmud. The realization that the Mishnah, too, has its own independent value or status, and we can understand the Mishnah maybe even different than the way that the Talmud interprets it. So here too, we are realizing that the Amoraim are not necessarily interpreting the Mishnah according to its original meaning. Here too, we are becoming more skeptical. We're less accepting and more challenging what seemed to have been something that was perceived as more obvious. So what are we going to do today? What's going to be the outline of today's class? We're going to start by talking briefly about the Talmud's interpretation of the Mishnah, just to present some basic facts. What does it mean that the Talmud interprets the Mishnah? Just to provide some background information. Then we will proceed and we will discuss the rise or the emergence of independent study of the Mishnah. When did people start learning Mishnah independently, not as part of the Talmudic discourse, but rather as independent text? When did this come up? 3, when did scholars start speculating or raising the question, why did the Talmud not explain the Mishnah accurately? How did they explain that phenomenon? When does this come up? Finally, 2 concluding comments. We'll talk briefly about freedom of thought and also about the shift from theory to practice, all involving the theme of the Mishnah's plain sense. And then at the end, we'll say a few words of conclusion if time allows, as I told you before. So we're starting from the beginning now. The Talmud's interpretation of the Mishnah, just in case some of you are not as familiar with the basic facts, I'll just say a few words. But I imagine that most of you at least heard of these texts. The Mishnah, when we're talking about the Mishnah, we're talking about a legal codex from the 2nd century, includes words of the Tanaim, statements, collection of statements by the Tanaim, edited at the end of the 2nd century, as I said, by Rabbi Judah the Prince, more or less at the end of the 2nd century. It has 6 orders, 60 tractates, divided into to chapters and to individual laws. The Mishnah is not sorted according to the books of or in linking to the Torah, but rather divided by themes. The 6 orders are divided by themes. So this is the Mishnah. The Talmud, when we speak about the Talmud in today's class, we will mainly refer to the Babylonian Talmud, not to the Palestinian Talmud, the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, which essentially is an interpretation of parts of the Mishnah. The Babylonian Talmud does not interpret the entire Mishnah, but rather more or less 4 out of the 6 orders. We're not here to get into all the details here. So it interprets major parts of the Mishnah. It's the work that somewhere between the 5th, 6th, maybe even later century was edited. This work includes the statements of the Amoraim and edited, at least traditionally, this is what people assume, by Rav Ashi and Ravina, 2 of the leading Amoraim. So these are the 2 texts we're talking about. And what we're going to be discussing today is the validity of the Talmudic interpretation of the Mishnah. Just like in the previous session, we spoke about the shift from the Bible, from the Torah, to the drashot, to the drash of the Tanaim. Here we're talking about a later stage, the shift from the Mishnah to the interpretation that is found in the Talmud. I imagine that most of you already have studied Talmud in the course of your life in one place or another, so I'm not going to get into all the details. I will allow you to talk a little bit, and I will assume that you're pretty much familiar. When we talk about the Talmudic interpretation to the Mishnah, the Talmud's interpretation of the Mishnah, I want to ask you a very basic question. Why does the Talmud need to interpret the Mishnah? Why do we need an interpretation to the Mishnah? The Mishnah is in pretty clear Hebrew, straightforward, gives us precisely, it formulates pretty clearly all the halachot, all the laws. So what does it mean? Why does the Talmud need to interpret the Mishnah? What kind of questions is the Talmud concerned by when it interprets the Mishnah? I just want us to give us a very basic sketch. What type of questions interest the Talmud when it interprets the Mishnah? It's a question. Yes, so David, you'll say 1.
Definition of terms that are not clearly understood.
Okay, so explaining terms in the Mishnah that are not 100% clear, coherent.
2, what is the Mishnah's statement based on?
Okay, great.
Menahani mile.
Okay, what are the source of the laws in the Mishnah? Okay. David, I'll let somebody else add, okay? And if there's more for you to add, you'll say. Anybody else wants to add? What is the Talmud doing when the Talmud interprets the Mishnah? What type of questions interest the Talmud when interpreting the Mishnah? Anybody else who has ever studied the Talmud wants to add anything? Yes, Judy.
An attempt to try to see it in application to reality.
Okay, excellent.
Case studies, in essence.
Okay, anybody else?
They seem to come up with a lot of questions.
Yeah, they have a lot of questions.
In addition,
So-
so the Mishnah is kind of a takeoff point for them in a way.
Right. So I'm going to address now the parts of the Talmud that address the Mishnah. I'm not talking about the deviations to Agadah and all sorts of other stuff.
Okay.
So I was trying to divide, and again, you can think about it in different ways. I was trying to sort the type of interpretations into three categories. The first category connects to understanding the Mishnah, just understanding what the Mishnah says. And this could be true on many levels. It starts with very basic questions, as determining what's the text of the Mishnah, what was the original formulation of the words. Language. The Mishnah includes many words that were not necessarily familiar, that not every student was familiar with. You have to take into account the Mishnah includes many words that are not just Hebrew. There are many, many words in Greek and even words in other languages every now and then. And the Talmud needs to explain what these words mean. You can think of many, many words, puzbul, hinuma, many, many words. I'm talking about hundreds of words in Greek in the Mishnah as well. But it's not just language, it's also terms, objects, places. The next thing, grammar, understanding the grammar of the Mishnah. All sorts of grammatic questions come up every now and then. So this is on the very basic level. But I will include in understanding the Mishnah also questions that are already more advanced, such as the things that David was mentioning, the source of the laws in the Mishnah, whether it's biblical or rabbinic source. What's the source? What's the origin of these laws? Identifying who were the sages who are speaking in the Mishnah. Very often, the Mishnah does not tell us explicitly who is the sage, who is the authority that is speaking here. We want to know who's that guy, man, tana, who's the person who's speaking. So that's on one level. Another level, or another type of questions is comparing the Mishnah with parallel sources, mainly Tanaitic sources, other sources of the Tanaim, such as sources within the Mishnah, but maybe in other tractates or in other orders, in the Tosefta, which is a competing Tanaitic collections of laws, Midrash Halacha that we've spoken about, or in general, Braita, Tanaitic text that didn't make it into the Mishnah. That's another important element that the Talmud is occupied with, contrasting the Mishnah with other sources. Finally, Judy, that was your contribution. Applying the Mishnah, determining the laws of the Mishnah, especially if there's a machloket, controversies, limiting or expanding the law. The Mishnah might speak about a particular case. Do we want to expand it or just leave it, or maybe even narrow it down? Applying the laws in changing circumstances. The Mishnah was speaking about one reality. What about other realities that come up? So these are the type of questions I think we can somewhat classify. I advise any one of you who's studying the Gemara, the Talmud, it's a good habit to ask yourself when you study, what exactly are the questions that the Talmud is interested in? I find it very useful to try to think what type of questions interest the Gemara. I would also add that it's hard to separate it because very often these questions get connected. For instance, if we contrast the Mishnah with the Tosefta and we have a contradiction, we might answer that we need to correct the words of the Mishnah. So then we suddenly deal with the text. Or we might say that these are two separate Tanaim who have stated those sources. So then we're also involving the identification of the sources and so on. But these are the type of questions but we're not going to be giving an introductory class to Talmud now. We're mainly interested in the bigger questions, which are the following. Very often when you study the Mishnah and then you study the Gemara, you might come up with the following questions. The first question is, does the Talmud interpret the Mishnah accurately? Do we really feel that the Talmud is interpreting the Mishnah accurately, which would mean, what is accurate meaning of a text? As we mentioned in the previous session, what will be the right interpretation of the text?
The intent of the author.
Right. Is it following what the Mishnah really meant to say from the very beginning? Is the Mishnah, is the Gemara, is the Talmud, are the Amoraim doing a good job understanding the Mishnah? If you think the answer is yes, you may leave this class at this point. You're in good shape. However, I think that you're a little bit more sophisticated than that. And if not, if the answer is not, so the next question comes up, and that is, why is it that why does the Talmud deviate from the Mishnah's plain sense? What could be the causes for that to happen? Is it a matter of mistakes, misunderstandings? What's going on? Why does the Talmud deviate from what the Mishnah meant to say? That's going to be the second question that we ask. Again, if we decided that the Talmud misinterprets the Mishnah and that it should be interpreted differently. So the following question, now we're going to talk about two practical questions. Can a student come up or suggest an alternative meaning to the words of the Mishnah? Is that a legitimate thing to do? And finally, what should be the status of the laws that are based upon misinterpretations of the Mishnah? Should we change halakha now once we figured out that the Talmud misinterpreted Tanaitic texts? Should that have any implications on law? What we're going to do today is talk about the history, how people dealt with these questions. We will mainly emphasize the great revolution that takes place in the 19th century in this realm. And in today's discussion, in a sense, it's a much greater revolution than what we've done in the previous week, because the realization that the Chazal, that the rabbis are not reading the Bible according to its plain sense, was something that was known early on in Jewish history. The difference between Pshat and Drash when it comes to the Bible, that was something that scholars were familiar with for centuries before. The 19th century scholars did add something in the way they understood that phenomena, but the very basic realization that we're talking about two separate things, that was something that was known. But when it comes to the Mishnah and the Talmud, we're talking about a radical change or a very big revolution, and this is what we're going to do today. So we're starting our journey now, and we're going to do it step by step. So the first step is going to involve the early beginnings of this process, and we're going to talk briefly about independent study of the Mishnah. If you were to go through medieval texts or medieval treatments of the Mishnah in the Talmud, you will see that in the medieval period, it seems that most scholars never thought of the Mishnah as an independent corpus, as an independent text. It seems that most scholars saw or read the Mishnah as part of the Talmudic discourse. It was not really perceived as an independent text. It was really taken as part of the Talmudic discourse. People viewed the Mishnah almost entirely through the lens of the Talmud, the way the Amoraim interpreted that text. How can you tell that? What are the indications for that? How do we know that medieval scholars hardly ever treated the Mishnah as an independent text? What would be the indications for that? Why am I saying yes, David?
Lack of independent corpus of the Mishnah as not a book, but as a continuous scroll, for example.
Okay, excellent. So the first thing is manuscripts. When you look for manuscripts of the Mishnah in the medieval period, there are rarely any manuscripts that only include the Mishnah. 99% of the manuscripts are manuscripts that are Mishnah with the Talmud included together, bound together. You will hardly find manuscripts of the Mishnah that are put as independent text. That's one clear indication. The other one is what? So one of them involves manuscripts, which indicate what did people study. What other indication gives the same impression? Not just the manuscripts, but also what? Interpretations. We can rarely find any interpretations to the Mishnah in the medieval period, meaning from the 11th to the 15th century. I'll soon talk about the exceptions, but generally speaking, we hardly find interpretations to the Mishnah. People study the Mishnah as part of the Talmud. They wrote commentary to the Talmud, not to the Mishnah on its own. On this slide, I included two exceptions, but these are exceptions, and I don't think they change the general picture. The first, on the left-hand side, you see one of the most important manuscripts of the Mishnah. I'm sure those of you are familiar with the manuscript. Which manuscript is this?
Brachot.
It's from Brachot, but which manuscript is it?
Oh.
It's one of the most important manuscripts. It's not Leningrad, it's Kaufmann's.
Ah,
It's Kaufmann's, which is found today in Budapest. This is one of the most famous manuscripts of the Mishnah, but also one of the only manuscripts that only include the Mishnah. It was only in Italy and in surrounding areas where people studied Mishnayot independently. But throughout Europe and North Africa or all these areas, you will not find texts that only include Mishnayot. Even in the Gniza, there are fairly small number of texts that only will include Mishnayot. And this is the other exception. This is a page from Maimonides' commentary to the Mishnah, interpretation to the Mishnah. So you might argue there were people who interpreted the Mishnah. So we can say two things about that. First, Maimonides is an exception in this realm. There are very few people who wrote commentaries to the Mishnah, especially to the orders of the Mishnah that are interpreted by the Talmud. And even Maimonides, even Rambam, when interpreting the Mishnah, he's basically, generally speaking, summarizing the Talmud's interpretation of the Mishnah. That's what he's mainly doing in his interpretation to the Mishnah. He's not really coming up with his own insights on the Mishnah. So generally speaking, in the medieval period, people did not think of the Mishnah as an independent text. It was perceived as part of the Talmud. When did things start changing? So the first signs of an independent treatment of the Mishnah, still not rejection of the Talmud, still not any attempt to attack the Talmud or to dismiss the Talmud's interpretation, but at least independent study of the Mishnah, we can trace in the 16th and 17th century. In the 16th and 17th century, we find growing number of scholars learning Mishnayot, not Talmud, but rather the Mishnah independently. Can anybody speculate briefly, because we're short in time, why does that happen? What's the context that leads people to study Mishnayot independently? On what ground? Why? Why abandon the Talmud and focus on the Mishnah as an independent text?
Printing press?
Printing press, what about it?
Well, it just made all these, we haven't spoken about it much in this class, but I think about it often because it made texts available and severable in a way, you know?
Okay, so we'll talk about, it's a very good insight, but we need to still to add something to what you're saying, because you would still expect people to print Mishnah with the Talmud like they've done before. Other ideas?
the Yerushalmi was preserved more in Italy than in other parts of Europe.
Okay, but why? So how does that help people start looking at the Mishnah as an independent text? So you have a competing Talmud.
Right, but the Mishnah, as recorded in the Yerushalmi, is sometimes different than that reported.
Right. But that would still, I think, not make people start studying Mishnayot, abandoning the Talmudic discourse altogether. That would just make people realize there's not one form of Mishnah, and maybe that there are two forms of interpretation. The treatment of the Yerushalmi is also a very crucial part of the story. We're not going to address this so much here, but I think that this is not the main concern. And I want to talk about three things that are changing drastically in the 16th and the 17th century.
Well,
the first thing, yes.
No, I was thinking about the influence of the Renaissance thinking. Obviously, people didn't wake up and say, oh, now we live in the Renaissance. But there was a way of thinking of going back to newly discovered sources and perhaps going back to looking at texts that, well, maybe we could learn something if we examine this independently. Okay,
so we will get a little bit to what you're saying soon. Okay, not yet. It's not this slide, in two slides from now.
Okay.
One thing is connected to the mystical context of the study of the Mishnah. In Tzfat, in the 16th century, there are a lot of Kabbalist people, especially Rabbi Yosef Karo in his circles, who are very interested in studying the Mishnah. Why is that? In Sefer HaZohar, which becomes much more has much more influence starting from the 16th century when it was also printed for the first time. In Sefer HaZohar, you find numerous places where Sefer HaZohar advises people or recommends that you should occupy yourself with the Mishnayot. I brought one example of many in Sefer HaZohar. This is, I think, from Parashat Bereshit. Man dekari vetani shit sidrei Mishnah, da hu man diada לסדרה ולקשרה קישורה וייחודה דמראה כדקאיות. This is from Sefer HaZohar. Enid, you want to read it in English?
Oh,
Whoever.
whoever studies scripture and the 6 orders of the Mishnah, this is the one who knows how to order and bind the unification of the Lord as is fitting.
Okay, so you get a sense it's important to study Mishnayot. Here you see a book called Magid Meisharim. Magid Meisharim is a very interesting book. It's Rabbi Joseph Caro's mystical diary, if you want to call it. And who communicates with Rabbi Yosef Karo? Who speaks to him? It's not God himself or any angel. Who communicates with Rabbi Yosef Karo in Magid Meisharim in his diary? Any guess? It's the Mishnah itself. The Mishnah speaks to Rabbi Yosef Karo, whatever that means. I didn't go through such an experience myself, so I can't tell you how it feels.
Cool.
But he's communicating with the Mishnayot very often. So the Mishnah is one important, the mystical connection is one reason why people start occupying themselves with the Mishnah. In Tzfat, in other areas close by, people study the Mishnah in a sense, in a technical manner. They recite it and they go over and again, as if this is like a prayer book and not always studying the Mishnah. But it does make people think of this book independently.
Might another reason be the way Christians look back to the quote unquote Old Testament, you know, as the original
Excellent.
source.
We'll get this in a second. Excellent comment. We'll get there in 1 second. The second context or the second background that leads to this is pedagogic motivation. Maharal Prague is mainly connected to this revolution, was preaching many places in his writings that something needs to change in the Jewish educational system. He felt that young kids delve into the sea of the Talmud too early, and sometimes they just don't have a sense what goes on there. Many people study the Talmud and they're not meant to be rabbis or dayanim. It's not for them to get into the Talmud. They should just study Mishnayot, and that's it, and then go to get a job. This is not my words. I'm not talking myself. That's what Maharal Prague is saying. They should just get a job and stop studying in the yeshivot. He felt that people are jumping into the Talmud too soon without really being prepared for this, and that this is what they do also in later stages of their learning, and it's not really a thorough or a systematic way of studying stuff. So he recommends that people should first study everything gradually, and 2, if you're not made for the Talmud, it's just great to stop at the Mishnahs and not go on. Maharal Prague leads people to form Mishnayos or chavurot, groups of people who are dedicated to the study of the Mishnah. This is another reason why people start learning Mishnayot independently. One of the people that was extremely influenced by Maharal Prague was Rabbi Yom Tov Lipman Heller, who is also the author of Tosafot or Tosefet Yom Tov, which is one of the most important commentaries to the Mishnah, independent commentary to the Mishnah, not as part of studying the Talmud, but just commentary to the Mishnah. In his introduction, he even says, talking about the Maharal's influence, שנתחברו חבורות חבורות ומתעסקים יום יום פרק מפרקי משניות וחוזרים חלילה ומאת השם הייתה זאת חוק ולא יעבור. This is very loose English translation. I didn't sit and try to think every word. They form groups and they study a chapter from the Mishnah on a daily basis and so on. He goes on and talks about this. In some places in his book, he's also going to hint, but just hint, that the Mishnah might or should be interpreted independently, also when it comes to its meaning, but only rarely. The third context is what you are hinting in different ways, and that's the non-Jewish connection here. And here I want to link 3 important elements that might be connected to it in one way or another. The invention of print, censorship, and Hebraism. How exactly to tie up all these things is not something we're going to do, but I'll just at least suggest one thing. End of the 15th century, Jews start printing their books, but mainly in the 16th century. In the period of Reformation, people realized, in the 16th century, people realized that the book is very powerful. Printed books can really change things. Many people say that the Reformation, in a sense, was an outcome of this important invention. You're able to circulate and spread ideas very fast in larger quantities or larger crowds. On this ground, Christians, the Catholic Church, starts censorizing Jewish books. Some books they just prohibit from publishing altogether. Others, they just give rules how you're supposed to censor these texts. For a good number of decades in the middle of the 16th century and also in the 17th century, you're not allowed to print the Talmud in many, many cities in Europe. In Italy, the Talmud was a prohibited text for a few decades. From the 1550s until the 1590s, you were not allowed to print the Talmud in Europe in many, many areas, and especially in Italy. But at the same time, what was allowed?
The Mishnah.
The Mishnah. There, we do find people publishing editions of the Mishnayot alone. It's not considered from the Christian perspective as one book. This also might be linked to Hebraism, which is the Christian interest in Jewish sources that also emerges at the same time. And Christians were interested, as you were saying before, in understanding the background of Christianity. Where did Jesus come from? What was the kind of culture that he grew up in? The Mishnayot might be more important for that purpose. And we find all sorts of tractates of the Mishnah that appear in the 16th and 17th century, not necessarily for Jewish audience, but some of them also are being used by Jews. So we can think of various reasons, but the bottom line is very clear. People start studying Mishnayot independently. In the 16th and 17th century, you will just find people learning Mishnayot. You will not really encounter people criticizing so much the Talmud's interpretation of the Mishnah. But once you read the Mishnah and you become familiar with studying the Mishnah independently, it's soon going to come up. People will start realizing that when we read the Mishnayot, we might get different impressions than what we do when we read it as part of the Talmud. This revolution will reach its peak, or will become actually a real thing in the 18th and then mainly in the 19th century. And this is what we're going to talk about now. It's in the 18th and mainly in the 19th century that people start realizing the Talmud misinterprets the Mishnah. What the Talmud is saying is not really what the Mishnah is teaching us. Why did the Talmud not explain the Mishnah accurately? So as I said, in the 19th century, people start attacking the Talmud. People start criticizing the Talmud, or at least being aware of the fact that the Talmud misinterprets the Mishnah. It would sound very tempting to tie this to the rise of a whole field in European academic world called, in German you called hermeneutics, hermeneutika in Hebrew, the field of interpretation. Scholars such as Friedrich Schleiermacher, Dilthey, if you heard of these people, are very interested in understanding how one is supposed to interpret texts. And they often speak about the fact that the real meaning of the text only follows what the author had in mind. So it's tempting to connect this revolution to this type of scholarship, although it's probably not the case, because we find Jews throughout Europe, even people who are not really part of the academic world. They never heard about Friedrich Schleiermacher or people of his circles. They all come up with this realization. The Talmud is not really presenting the only meaning of the Mishnah, and not necessarily the accurate meaning of the Mishnah. What we will do now, we really have to rush because I want to finish this with you. We're going to go and travel in the next 10, 15 minutes throughout Europe. And you will see that in various locations throughout Europe, where Jews live and Jews learn Torah, they say the same idea. They might explain the Talmud's deviation of the Talmud in different ways. They might use different terminologies, but they all say the same. They all repeat the same basic realization. Let's start with Lithuania. Who's the hero of the Jewish community in Lithuania? I don't need to tell you. Who's the first maskil, maybe the first enlightened Jew in Lithuania, or at least that way that people want to present him? Who am I referring to? The big hero of Vilna,
Vilna, of course, the Vilna Gaon.
the Gra, Hagaon Vilna. Rabbi Eliyahu Vilna, the Gra, is considered as an important figure in paving the way for modern thinking in Lithuania. He's a hero in Vilna even nowadays. Like when I visited there a few years ago, you see statues of the Gaon everywhere in the streets there. So Rabbi Eliyahu Vilna, the Gra, here is also one of the first scholars in Lithuania who speaks about the Mishnah's original meaning in contrast to the way that the Talmud interprets it. Here you have the covers of 3 books. The first one is called Shnot Eliyahu, which is the Gra's interpretation of the Mishnah. This interpretation was only published after the Gra died. We don't really know exactly what was the state of this book in his lifetime, but this is a collection of interpretations of the Gra to the Mishnah. The other 2 are books put out by his students. The middle book is a book put by an important Jewish maskil, enlightened Jew, called Rabbi Menashe Me'ilya. Did you ever hear this name? He's one of the first important maskilim in Lithuania. He puts a book called Sefer Binat Mikra. And the book on the right-hand side is called Sefer Gvi'i Gvi'a HaKesef, put by Rabbi Binyamin Rivlin. He's connected to the current Rivlin, the president of the state of Israel now. He's one of his ancestors. And they all say one important common idea, which you see here in the first line. This is quoted from Rabbi Binyamin Rivlin. Shamati me'adoni mori ve'Rabbi HaGaon Zatzal. I heard from my teacher, the Gra, I've heard from my master, she'amishnah nidrash be'pshat udrash. That the Mishnah has pshat and drash. Meaning, when the Talmud interprets the Mishnah, it's only the drash of the Mishnah. It's not really the plain sense of this text. Just like the Torah has pshat v'drash, so does the Mishnah. What the Talmud is doing is only giving us the drash of the Mishnah, but it's not really the Mishnah's pshat. This is a fairly moderate way of a revolutionary statement. It's revolutionary because you're acknowledging that what the Talmud is saying is not the meaning of the Mishnah, is not the only meaning of the Mishnah, but it's still presented in moderate language. Why moderate language? What makes this a moderate revolution? Yes?
You don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Right. You're not saying the Talmud is wrong. You use traditional terminology for your critical insight. You're saying it's just a matter of pshat and drash. This is something that people are familiar with. People are familiar with when it comes to the Tanakh. It's also a moderate way of presenting it because, after all, we don't have to reject the drash. We're just saying that there's an additional layer of understanding called the pshat. Nevertheless, this is still a very big revolution because it's one thing to talk about pshat and drash when it comes to the Torah. This is the divine composition, so we can assume that God can talk in multiple meanings or provide multiple meanings to his words. But a human composition does not necessarily bear different layers of meaning. But the Gra and his students employ very moderate or very conservative type of terminology to express this idea. The Mishnah will have pshat and drash. The Talmud is just the drash of the Mishnah, but you can come up with its own pshat. Before we move on, I just want to show you something cute. In this book of Rabbi Menashe Me'ilya, you see that these are the most coherent letters. The middle one. You see what he says on the bottom. It's cute to see it. He says, Lo hisagti. You see on the bottom part here, where I will show my arrow. 1 second, you will see it. Lo hisagti etzel hamadpisim otiyot meruba'im ve'gdolim. I couldn't get big, not otiyot meruba'im. I couldn't get small letters in the publishing house, only big letters. It might be useful for people to read this book that they can read the words here. So this is a nice, interesting comment. We're going on. From Lithuania, we're traveling to Galicia. Galicia is the part of Poland that was taken over by the Austrian Empire. And here, people too refer to the plain sense of the Mishnah, but here the terminology is quite different. Here, people are speaking in much more radical terminology. Because unlike Lithuania, where people are talking about Pshat and Drash of the Mishnah, here people will start talking about the Talmud as misinterpreting the Mishnah, as getting things wrong. It's not just Pshat v'Drash. It's correct and incorrect, the right meaning and the wrong interpretation of the Mishnah. I'm going to give you a few examples for this briefly. The big hero of the Galician in the Galician context is a guy not as known. His name is Hirsch Mendel Pinellas. That's this guy. Many, many years back, I wrote my master's thesis about him. This is many, many years back. And after I concluded my work, I found his photo, his picture, and I was so happy. It was for me like, you're right. You work on a scholar for half a year, and suddenly you see what he looks like. That was a big day for me. So this is what he looks like. It's the only picture of his that survived. And he writes a book called Dakasha Torah. It sounds like a very nice name, very elegant name. It might even sound traditional, but it's not really as traditional. In the introduction, he says that the goal of this book, among other things, lehagen al ha-mishnah b'makom she'hatalmud motzi et ha-mishnah midei pshuta, or to defend the Mishnah where the Talmud abandons its plain sense, where the Talmud deviates from its plain sense. You see that the connotation here is very, very different. We're not talking about Pshat and Drash. We need to defend the Mishnah from the Amoraim. The Amoraim are misreading this text. They don't understand the book. And we need to defend the Mishnah, to reconstruct its original meaning. You see also in the title page, you can see it's slightly differently formulated. Lehatzdik ha-Torah shebe'al peh bichlal ulehagen al ha-Mishnah bifrat. We're trying to defend the Mishnah. Who are we defending the Mishnah from?
Talmud.
From the Talmud, from the Amoraim. They misunderstand this text. This is a Pinellas book. Again, a side point, an amusing piece of information. You can just imagine how traditional Jews love this book. And a few years later, somebody puts another book called, you see on the right-hand side, Kachi Dakasha Torah. This is in opposition to Pinellas's book.
Oh.
You didn't get it right. This is the way we study Torah. The Talmud is always correct. Side point. It's not just Pinellas. Other people in the same region as well. I just brought you a few quotes, and you will see people here are thinking very differently. One place, he says, when the Amoraim were not familiar with the authentic meaning of the Mishnayot, they interpreted them in far-fetched ways. Bedrachim zarim verechokim. This is not Drash versus Pshat. It's wrong and right. Yoshua Esheshor, who is the editor of the top of a periodical called HaChalutz, a very radical, liberal periodical of the time, writes, Ha'amora yada v'yada. The Amora knows what he's doing. And why is he misunderstanding the Mishnah? Kedei leharbot bepilpul shel hevel. This is an idiotic pilpul.
Pretty far there.
Shlomo Yuda Leib Rapaport, who was the head of who was the Av Beit Din in Prague in his later years, a very important figure in the 19th century. In a letter published in 1833, writes about the Amoraim in the Babylonian Amoraim, that the learning methods in Babylon in the Babylonian yeshivot were very sophisticated, charifim, pilpulim, ach lo ala derech hayashar va'emet, but not accurate.
Wow.
What leads, from their perspective, what leads to the misunderstanding of the Talmud? It's two things. A, the rabbis are drawn after pilpul. They can't think straight. Their brains don't work right. That's one reason. And also because they're not familiar with the historical context of the Mishnah. They live in Babylon under Persian rule. They don't know Greek. They never visited Israel in their lifetime. They can't even picture what the things look like. They don't understand the culture. How can they get the meaning of the Mishnah? There's such a big cultural gap that doesn't allow them to understand this text, even if they wanted to, but they misinterpret the Mishnah. We're moving quickly to Italy. I promised you we're going to do a very quick journey throughout Europe. You know this guy.
Wait, who is that?
Shadal. Who's Shadal? Shadal, who's Shadal? Yes, David.
David Luzzatto.
Right, Shmuel David Luzzatto, Samuel David Luzzatto, Italian scholar. He wanted, before he got into biblical studies, he started writing an entire interpretation to the Mishnah in his younger years, in his earlier years of his life. He wanted to write an entire book on the Mishnah. He was planning perhaps to turn it into a dictionary to the Mishnah. And look what he says in one of his memories. Katabti et kol ele, I wrote this insight or this idea, bizman she'ala belibi lefaresh lashon HaMishnah. When I was invested in the Mishnah, when I was planning to interpret the Mishnah. V'hachiloti, I started min me'ematai. What's the word me'ematai?
The first word.
The first word of the Mishnah. I started from word 1. Uperashti kol teiva ve'teiva b'diuk. I explained every word. Ve'achar kach natashti tamlacha. Then I had to leave this. Leman tet libi limudim asher nikreti lelamed b'kolegiazem hazeh. I had to give up this dream because I started teaching in the Padua Rabbinical Seminary and he was teaching Bible. But later on he adds, En hasha'ar sagur ba'adenu levakesh ta'am ledinei ha'mishnah mibal'adei ha'tam or ha'tamim ha'muva'im b'Talmud. The gate is not closed or sealed, and we may provide alternative interpretations to the one that appear in the Talmud. His point was this, his main emphasis was the Talmud does not really have a tradition when it comes to the Mishnah. David, you were mentioning before that the Mishnah does not provide us the reasons for every law. The Amoraim were not any better. They didn't have the sources. They were just speculating themselves. Why can't we come up with our own speculations as well? Finally, Germany. Here too we have two rabbis, Abraham Geiger and Zcharia Frenkel, two leading rabbis in Germany, the founders of Reform and Conservative Judaism, maybe. Geiger, in his diary from 1829, says he also had a dream to interpret the Mishnah from an entire corpus. He also put out a book on the Mishnah. You see it on the left-hand side, Lehr und Lesebuch zur Sprache der Mishnah. He wrote a book, which is essentially a textbook, and also a book that deals with the Mishnaic Hebrew. And here he also says, early on, haya barur li, kvar bazman hahu haya barur li. Early on, I realized, keshem sheruach haTalmud nivdelet mizo shel hamikra, just like the Talmud does not really comprehend the Bible well, kach gam shnei chelkei haTalmud, haMishnah veHagmara, nitzavim harchek ze mizeh. Meaning, just like the Talmud misinterprets the Bible, so does the Talmud misinterpret the Mishnah. These are two independent texts. However, in Germany, people don't view this as a mistake. They prefer to view this as a conscious thing. The Amoraim want to change the law, but they're not going to just cancel what the Mishnah say or reject what the Mishnah says. In a form of interpretation, what essentially they're doing, they're trying to make the halakha go in their direction. They use the media of interpretation, but their main goal is to change Jewish law. So through these misinterpretations, essentially what they're doing, they're trying to lead the halakha in different directions. When they don't agree with the Mishnah, they misinterpret it so that it would agree with what they want the Mishnah to be saying.
Mm.
We spoke about different patterns, but the common theme is here. The Mishnah is really not interpreted accurately by the Talmud. You can call it pshat udrash, you can call it misunderstanding, you can talk about this as a deliberate decision that was done by the Amoraim. But the common conclusion is the Mishnah is misinterpreted by the Talmud. We need to get to the concluding parts. And I want to talk about two interesting outcomes of this discovery that I think can provide us a greater sense about the nature of modern Jewish studies. And this involves the outcome of these realizations on two levels. One level I want to discuss, and one level I want to ask you, how did people address the questions of coming up with new meanings or new readings of the Mishnah? And here you see something very interesting. You remember in the very beginning, I first addressed the question, is the Talmud reading the Mishnah accurately? But I also asked, Does the Mishnah, can one suggest his new innovative readings of the Mishnah? Is it allowed? Is it legitimate to come up with your own reading of the Mishnah? You see something very interesting in the course of the 19th century. In the earlier part of the 19th century, people addressed this as a regular halachic question, as a legal question. Is it allowed or is it not allowed to come up with your own insights? Are you allowed to offer your own independent understanding of the Mishnah? That's the way people treat this question earlier on. As time goes by, and I think it's a fascinating thing, you realize people treat this question very differently. They don't really address this anymore as a legal decision. Are you allowed or are you not allowed to interpret the Mishnah differently? They suddenly realize that thinking critically is something that you don't really choose to do, but rather what? You don't choose to be a scholar. You don't choose to think about things critically, but rather what?
Find the truth.
It's the truth. If you think this is, if something is true, if something is right, you can't really fight it anymore. You're not able to decide not to talk about it in such a manner. Critical thinking basically takes over. It's not something that we choose to do. It's not a decision we decide. Do we want to be traditional or critical? It's something that is kind of forcing us. Once you adopt this type of thinking, you just can't stop, you can't avoid it anymore. I want to show you one example. Isaac Hirsch-Weiss, a scholar in Vienna, writes an article called En HaMishnah Yotzet Midei Pshuta, devoted to our theme. This appears in his periodical called Bet HaMidrash, also appeared in Vienna, 1865. And he raises the question, Im hareshut netuna lekol ish ve'ish, are we allowed to lefaresh HaMishnah al pi da'ato, asher chanano Hashem? Are we allowed to come up with our own innovative ideas when it comes to the Mishnah? Neged da'at hakadmonim ba'alei Talmud, in contrast to what the Talmud is saying. And look at his answer. This is what I want us to focus on. Bitul da'at hami'ut neged harov. I'll have this translated in English in a second. Lo yu'umat ela bivchinat ma'aseh. You can cancel the opinion of the minority and follow majority only when you're talking about it on a practical level. What should be the halacha on a practical level? Aval lo bivchinat hamachshava ha'de'ah hu hamachshava. You can't tell a person to start thinking. Tell him how to think. If I think that I come up with my own way of reading the Mishnah, if I think this is what the text meant to say, you can't tell me it's not allowed to think. You're not allowed to think that in such a way. Scholarship takes over. Critical thinking is already the only way you can view things, at least for scholars. It's not something we choose to do. We don't choose to be bad people and think about things critically. We can't think differently anymore. We understand this is what the text meant to say. What do you want me to stop thinking that? Not be allowed to think critically? I can't control that anymore. It stops being a legal question. It becomes a necessity. He goes on, he says, Lo yitachen, this I didn't translate to English, Lo yitachen lachuf, to force de'ah ve'machshava, ki kfiya kazot, hi neged hateva. It's against nature to tell a person not to think something. איך אפשר שנחליט דעה מן הדעות אשר דעתנו חושבת היפוכה? How can we adopt one opinion if we really think something different? It's not a choice anymore. That's on the one level. This is one interesting insight that comes up, and I think it's revealing. It tells us what takes place here. Critical scholarship becomes something that is much more dominant now. It's not something that is just a marginal thing anymore. But another thing takes place, and this is something more on the practical level. And this, again, we can go on and talk about this for hours. I'm just giving you tiny bits of this whole discussion. People also started asking, what should be the halacha from now on? If the Amoraim didn't understand the Mishnah, if they're not interpreting the Mishnah accurately, perhaps we should change halacha now. Perhaps we should start rethinking Jewish law. Let us explain more specifically. For people who say that Talmud is the drash and the Mishnah is just the pshat, it's not a big deal because we are familiar with following the drash. Also for people like German scholars who will say that the Talmud is doing this consciously, so we don't need to abandon the Talmud. The Talmud knows what it's doing. It doesn't want to maintain the halacha in the Mishnah. It wants to interpret it differently. But people who say, like in Galicia, that the Talmud misunderstood the Mishnah, it doesn't know Greek, it doesn't understand the culture, it doesn't understand the meaning, people just don't think straight. Should we change halakha? Earlier on in the 19th century, many scholars say, yes, to come up with a critical insight and not follow through, also when it comes to practical halakha, it's being a hypocrite in a sense. You're not really loyal, or you're not consistent with your own ideas. Samuel Holdheim, a very important reform rabbi in the 19th century, in a book, a fascinating text called Ma'amar HaIshut. I'm aware of the time, I know.
No,
So he writes a fascinating text. I wish I could bring you the entire thing. It's a fascinating passage, but among other stuff he says, I'm reading it in Hebrew and then my loose English translation. He says, Mikol etz hagan achol tochel, ume'etz hadat tov vara lo tochal mimeno. You remember where this is from? You may surely eat from every tree of in the garden, but of the tree of knowledge, good and evil, you may not eat. What is he trying to say? Are you not going to eat from the tree of wisdom? Are you not going to follow through and actually follow your conclusions? And I skipped a little bit. What do we benefit searching after the truth, seeking the intentions of God in the Torah, if we don't act in accordance with our conclusions? You got to follow through. However, here too, I think something changes. And this is going to be my last new text of this mini-series. I think as time goes by, here too, people are becoming more mature in a sense. And they understand, you know what? You can come up with very interesting insights, critical insights about the real truth, but it doesn't really mean that you have to follow through. Because the reason that we're obligated to halakha, our commitment to halakha, is not just a matter of truth and false, right and wrong. There are many, many other considerations that we need to take into account. Hirsch Mendel Pinedis, I mentioned him before, the author of Dakasha Torah, was very radical in his insights about the Talmud, but nevertheless he says, although it's quite clear to me that the Mishnah's view is different than the Talmud's conclusion, I will not act accordingly. Why? Right? You must honor our forefathers in earlier generations. The Talmud gained its role not just because it's always right, because this text became an authoritative text regardless. This is also the text that keeps us together as one nation. If each one will follow his own halakha and just follow his own critical insights, we'll go nowhere. Our commitment to halakha is way beyond critical scholarship. And I think this is another stage in the maturity of critical scholars. On the one hand, they can't reject their critical ideas, but at the same time, they understand Jewish life is not just about scholarship. There are other factors that play a role in our commitment to halakha. And even if you're very liberal in the way you think, you might still want to keep your own traditional ways or practices. You don't immediately just throw everything away because you came across with some theory about the Mishnah or the Talmud or anything else. So both of these outcomes or issues that come up in this discussion of the Mishnah's plain sense, I think tell us a greater story beyond the particular story of Mishnah versus Talmud. It gives us a sense how people understood critical scholarship as the century goes on. Okay, we're done with this, the new stuff, and I'll just remind us what we've done. It's going to take us 1 minute, I promise you. I'm just reviewing you what we've done in this mini series, so you remember. Part 1, theoretical part. We spoke about title and definition of Wissenschaft as Judentums. We tried to distinguish between traditional and critical scholarship. Historical and ideological context of Wissenschaft as Judentums. We spoke about the inspiration, where the Jews get exposed to critical thinking, institutions, publications, and we spoke about the way people looked on this phenomenon later on. Was this a good thing or a bad thing? Is it only a way to bury the Jewish tradition, or perhaps it's something also instructive? That was the first part. The second part was more about the way it was actually done. We spoke about time, variety, we spoke about context, and we spoke about being more skeptical, understanding that the Amoraim are just human beings. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad and that we should just get rid of everything they said, but at least understand we're talking about a tradition that has many aspects to it. Okay, that's more or less. If we had more time, I would give you a quiz, but I'm not going to do that. If you can tell who's who here.
I can live with that.
You remember some of them at least?
Oh,
There are at least 30 people. I just gave you the top guys.
oh wait, I don't know.
Some of them are very famous. Who's this guy?
I can't recognize.
Lizzie,
his-
I see you know. Who's this guy?
That's Mendelssohn.
That's Mendelssohn. This guy, you know?
Geig? No.
That's Geiger.
Geiger.
That's short-term memory. That's from a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
This guy, you know? David, you should know.
Sorry, I was.
This guy. Who is this guy? It's connected to you. It's a David. That's Samuel David Luzzato. That's Shaddad.
Shadal.
That
You had a
This is
different
also-
picture. You had a different picture of him earlier.
Yeah. And this one also you're supposed to know, David. It's another David.
huh.
David Tzvi Hoffman. Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman. The other ones are less known. I'm not gonna put you
Huh.
through this. We can really go on. It's important to review what we've done. Okay, I'm really sad that this series is over,
Me
but
too.
that's it. I'm leaving you my email. If anybody wants to ask anything or additional information, I'll be happy to help as much as
Good.
I can. And I hope to see you in the future.
Toda rabah.
Thank
It's
you.
been
Okay.
Thank you very much.
absolutely wonderful and beautifully taught. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
I
Thank
second
you. You're the best students.
that.
Okay.
I'm so
So,
sorry I couldn't attend all of them, but a conclusion that just from this last session, I would say Ein Chadash Mitachat HaShemesh, because
That's
the
true.
same thing is going on right now with all the
Right,
new approaches to interpretation and et cetera, et cetera.
right. It tells a lot about current scholarship as well. But
Exactly.
I think what I was saying in a previous session, what's unique about this is that in the 19th century, these are people who are devoted to halakha. They're
Yeah,
observant
that's
Jews.
the
It's not people who are just outsiders who couldn't
Right.
care less about their
Right.
critical conclusions. These people need to explain it also on a
Makes
practical level. So that's what I think makes the 19th century, in a sense, even more interesting.
right.
It's the shift
And-
going on. It's the
And
change.
very applicable to the modern Orthodox community, which is struggling with these two.
Exactly. We're
Exactly.
just struggling 100 years later.
Right.
In the 19th century, Orthodox rabbis just dismissed this altogether, at least
Right.
many of them. They just didn't want to be involved in this. 100 years later, Orthodox Jews are getting more exposed to critical scholarship and they're going through the same dilemmas. And that's why I feel that they need to write and read 19th century scholarship, because you will see that a lot of these issues came about 100 years before and people gave them very interesting ideas. En chadash tachat hashamesh.
Thank you, thank you, thank
Thank
you.
Okay.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
We have many more classes happening all the time. You can find out more information as well as the registration links, as always, on our website at www.drisha.org/classes. And you can also watch all the classes live or watch recordings of the live classes at www.drisha.org/live.
Oh, great, great.
Thank you again.